Well, welcome. How nice to see all of you. Thank you for coming, for being here. It's a really great pleasure to host this event for the second time. Um, we had such a great response to this the last time. We had people asking about it and wanting to see it. So we said, let's do it again. And so we have quite a nice number of people that signed up for the second time, and we're all delighted to do it for the second time because it was so much fun before. We're here to talk about walking as meaning making in the context of two famous walks, the Camino and Hadrian's Wall, as told through the words of poet Suzanne Doerge and writer historian Bob Royalty. And just to make sure, I guess their names are there, but Suzanne, if you would just wave so we all know who you are. Okay, and then Bob as well. So Bob, okay, now we know who the featured speakers are. All right. For people who enjoy the fine art and practice of walking, and I know I do, and I'm sure many people do, this next hour should really be a treat. It was really a lot of fun last time. As we know, there's much more to walking than just putting one foot in front of the other, and that's what we're going to hear about. My name is Christine Brooks Cody. I'm the founder of Shanti Arts Publishing. We got our start back in 2011. And initially, we published a literary journal. Some of you may have seen it, Still Point Arts Quarterly. And let me admit somebody here. Still Point Arts Quarterly. We've been running this now for about 10 years. Here's another cover. Each issue has a theme and, lots of wonderful writing and poetry and images. Lots of information about that on our website. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. All right. Shortly after we started publishing the journal, though, we got an interest in doing books. Actually, a couple authors came to me and said, gosh, I wish you'd publish books. So we started doing that. And we cover a number of topics and genres, poetry, memoir, spirituality, nature, travel, and travel is what we're going to be talking about tonight. All right, let me just say a couple quick things about Zoom. Nothing new, just to remind you, please keep yourself muted. I see a lot of the mute signals on, so I think most of you are muted. But just so we don't hear any background noise from you or anything like that. And we will have a discussion and question portion later. And at that point, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, by all means, we'll look forward to that. I also suggest that you keep your chat box open. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little thing there that says chat. If you would just click on that, then off to the right of your screen, you'll see a white bar kind of open up. And if you want, if you look down at the bottom, it says type message here. And during the presentations, you can make comments, which I think really is a nice thing to do. You can type things like, that was a great point, or I really enjoyed your reading, or I couldn't agree more, whatever. But it's a nice way to kind of interact with one another while we're listening just to the presenter. And you can also, if you wish, post questions there, questions that we can come back to at the end, or you might want to post your question and then just to remind yourself to ask that, just stick it in the chat box so people can start thinking about it. All right, and I want to point out that this event is being recorded. Indeed, I'm just looking at the little sign there that says it is recording, just to make sure. So just so you're all aware of that. All right, just to give you a very rough agenda for the next hour and a quarter or so you know where we're going. Let me admit somebody here. First of all, I will introduce our presenters shortly, and I will turn things over to them. They will go back and forth. They have an agenda worked out between them, and they will be going back and forth talking about their walks and reading from their books. And so that will take about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time at the end for questions or discussion. 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever allows. But, certainly think about questions as we're going through, because that can be sometimes the liveliest part of the event. So looking forward to that. We should wrap up in about an hour and 15 minutes. All right. Today we will hear from two people who decided to each take a walk, a rather long walk, and they could never have imagined or planned for what emerged as a result. And here they are today telling their individual stories. But as you'll hear, those stories have very much in common. It's uncanny, actually, the ways in which their lives and stories have been on similar tracks. And they didn't know any of this until a few weeks ago when I had the idea to bring them together for this event. What is not uncanny, though, is that their walks led them to something grand and glorious and important. In each footstep, they found meaning. In each vista, in each stone, each friend they made along the way, they found meaning. And that's the story we're going to hear today. So let me introduce our presenters. Suzanne Doerge is an adult educator, probably a learner too, who has worked with organizations at the local, national, and international level to support the voices of marginalized communities. Originally from Southern Illinois, but you'll hear Canada in her voice, she lived in Nicaragua during the 1980s, where she met her compañero, Joe Gunn. They live in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, on the unceded land of the Algonquin people, where they raised their twins, Benjamin and Daniela. As a facilitator in the Amherst Writers and Artists method, she guides creative writing workshops. Her poems have been published in several journals and anthologies, in print and online, and this is her first published poetry collection. I'm sure many of you have already seen this. Some of you probably already have it, but that's the cover of her book, and that's her right there. Bob Royalty is professor of history and religion at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. He is coming to us today from North Carolina, where he spends quite a bit of time. He was raised in Atlanta. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Yale Divinity School, and Yale University Graduate School. Among other publications, he is the author of 2 scholarly monographs, one called The Streets of Heaven, and the other one, The Origin of Heresy, which sounds really interesting to me. He and his spouse, Anne, divide their time between Indiana and North Carolina. And with that, I will turn it over to them.
Thanks, Christine. We want to, excuse me, just quickly introduce what we were walking so you know the context. I was walking the Hadrian's Wall path. Hadrian was a 2nd century Roman emperor and built it along the northern edge of Britannia, the northernmost part of the Roman Empire at that point. The wall itself just celebrated a 1900-year anniversary, having been started in 122. And as you might know from the book, or you'll see, there's a bus that runs from April to October along the wall that's called the AD 122. That's the bus number. And the trail itself is newer. It just celebrated a 30th anniversary, I think, if I'm doing my numbers right. A national trail. It's about 84 miles. It was 80 Roman miles. I walked more than 100 miles because of a few diversions and many wrong turns.
And I also, just to start too, by thanking you, Christine and Shanti Arts, for hosting this book talk, for the previous book talk, and also, of course, for publishing our books and all the care that goes into making that happen. So I just wanted to say that as an opening on both of our behalf. So I walked with Joe Gunn there in the dark square there. I walked with Joe in 1996. We walked the Camino de Santiago, and we walked it for a month, about 700 kilometers. And we walked the path, which is one of the main paths that leads to Santiago de Compostela. The Camino itself is about 1,200 years old. It's not as old as Hadrian's Wall, but 250,000 people were walking it a year before COVID, and now that's starting to pick up again. It's an ancient Christian pilgrimage, and it is with the belief that when you reach Santiago, you become a new person because you've reflected along the way, much like going to Mecca, that when you arrive at the new place, you will be someone new. It's believed that Santiago, or Saint James, one of the disciples, is buried in Santiago de Compostela, and that's why it has been a traditional walk to go there. Today, people walk up from many sources of inspiration. For me, with Christianity being my background, I was very much in dialogue with Christianity. And what did that mean in my life? But also this idea of pilgrimage. The Camino is all about a pilgrimage. And so in many ways, many of you probably have been on other pilgrimages in your life, because what does it mean to be a pilgrim? It is this idea of meaning making. And Bob first talked about that in his book, that walking as meaning making, that when you're making meaning, or Mark Nepo says, and I really appreciate this quote, to travel and not be changed is to be a nomad, but to travel and be transformed by the journey is to be a pilgrim. So I think that's how you know you're on a pilgrimage, is the intention, and if you're being transformed, whether that's a walk, or of something you're taking on in your life. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that in reading the bio, Christine mentioned, that I'm on the unceded land of the Algonquin people. Well, that too is a Camino. Here in Canada, we're working very hard at reconciliation for the history of residential schools, the history of colonization. As a country, we're walking this Camino. And so that's a Camino. So it also might be something like that you're taking on in your life. So just to say, it's not always about going to Spain, but it's about where's your Camino and what's the intention with which you walk it.
Christine mentioned that we found a lot of similarities. And here's just a few of the things that I noticed in Suzanne's poems that I think you would see in my book as well. Well, the first one I wrote is free of burdens, but there's also burdens in my book, very much so. The idea of both an outward and internal journey, the theme of keeping going every day. One of the passages I'll be reading talks about meta thinking about what you're doing while you're doing it, and then how quickly life intervenes on the return.
And I experienced, I really enjoyed reading Bob's book because it did cause me a lot to reflect on what I experienced on the Camino. Some other phrases that he has: there's a taste of freedom, that you're set free of life's entanglements when you kind of leave everything behind, your job, your responsibilities, all those agendas, those emails, those Zoom calls, you leave them all behind and you are out there just walking. And it gives you a chance, as I think another thing you said, Bob, was I'll walk like this, life becomes simpler, focused, more clear. It gives you a chance to reflect on what you've done with your life. What do you want to do with your life going forward? How do you live that out as you go back? And both of us commented that we weren't quite sure what it was when we set out, but we both ended up reflecting on the death of someone very important in our lives. And just like we take that pain and disappointment with you, and we both were reflecting on that. Both of us had questions that we were trying to answer as we walked. And it reminded me of a quote from John Brierley, who wrote the guidebook for the bestseller guidebook, really, for the Camino. And what he says is, along the way, questions we ponder aren't necessarily answered, but they dissolve as we walk. Mm. And I felt that to be really true in your book, Bob. The other thing is this weaving, that as you're walking, you're thinking about your family, you're thinking about the history of the place you're walking in, you're in the midst of landscape, and some way or another, all that weaves together. Who you are, what your family is, what your history is, what the history of the place you're walking. And that really comes through in Bob's book. And the other thing I was struck by was when Bob said, because Bob's a religious scholar, and when you refer to yourself in the book as an archaeologist, and you talk about peeling back layers of meaning, and liken that also to the construction of the wall that you're walking, and what did that mean, but also to religion itself. And now religion itself is layered with meaning, both things that are deeply sacred for us, but also things that have happened, the ways that religion has been shaped by history and culture in ways that are also very harmful, as well as deeply inspiring. So it's all of that weaving together. And finally, I think the thing that really struck me was the question you point about that taking it back, how it's hard, like you, Bob, said, like you go back and suddenly your life takes over. But that question of, and as you said, how do we inspire to make ourselves and the world whole again? Or you quote the Jewish term tikkun olam. How do you do that? And as you're reflecting about how you want the world to be as you're walking, how do you actually put that into practice when you go back home? And I saw us both struggling with that and how to live that out.
Okay, I'll read a few passages that will reflect some of these ideas. And then Suzanne will read some poems, do some other things. Christine, I can't remember if you showed my book, but the subtitle is Walking Hadrian's Wall, a memoir of a father's suicide. So there's no surprise that this happens. It's right there on the front page. But I'll start reading about that. Why was I walking Hadrian's Wall? Because I wanted to is the simplest explanation. This started when I taught in England for a semester and visited the wall for a day with my wife, Anne, and my brother-in-law, Brian, while we were driving around the north of England. I was 53 at the time and enjoying my second sabbatical from teaching at a small liberal arts college in Indiana. Brian told me that people walked the length of the wall as a thing to do, and I was immediately hooked on the idea. I had visited Hadrian's Wall once before, but both visits in a car seemed inadequate. I didn't feel I'd gotten the full experience. I wanted to wake up and go to sleep along the wall, not drop in and out like a tourist who just saw ruins of forts and car parks. A car trip felt confined, and I wanted the freedom of walking the length of the wall alone. It was a challenge, something to prove. Turning 50 was a blast, parties and celebrations, a trip to Costa Rica for birding. As I found myself approaching 55, which was the year I walked the wall, I found myself in a more pensive mood, not depressed or sad, but thinking more about benchmarks and goals I wanted to accomplish next. Back on campus the following year for a full semester, with a full teaching load again, I started planning for the walk. For a professor, planning means finding money, and I was fortunate to get a couple of grants to travel to England and walk the following May, which would be my preparation for a big campus lecture the following fall. During the winter break that year, celebrating our first Christmas back at home after the sabbatical abroad, I realized it had been 25 years since we learned how sick my father was in 1990. He died the following May. I would walk the wall on the 25th anniversary of his suicide. I began to think differently about the lecture and the experience of walking the wall. This wasn't just a bucket list walk anymore, a shallow physical challenge to prove myself at 55, but a walk into a painful period in my own past of 25 years ago, a walk into my father's death and our life together. That's the story I'm telling in this book, a story of a walk across England and a walk into my past, a walk into the unknown. I would have a guidebook and a map, but I really didn't know where I was going. And right before I left, in that May, early May, before I left for England, we gave the flowers at our church. And for the first time, I said something publicly. So 25 years was the first time I'd really been public about this. Not that I had hidden it, but as you move on, you don't introduce yourself to people. Hi, my name is Bob. My father committed suicide 20 years ago. You just sort of move on. And so now it was coming out, and I think it was helpful for everybody. The next is about the first day of the walk, and I don't know if you've been to the north of England. There's a little picture of it behind me, very pretty. Stunning indeed is Hadrian's Wall path across the wild crags and moors of Northumberland and farm fields in Cumbria, some of the most picturesque scenery in northern England. But it starts east of Newcastle upon Tyne, where grimy bridges, warehouses, factories, and abandoned railway abutments greet you during the first few miles of the path. On the western side of Newcastle lie the huge Dunstan coal stays across the River Tyne on the south bank, memorials to the famous coals of Newcastle, where men loaded the ships heading to London. Soon after that, you head away from the river across busy roads and along sidewalks and motorways until finally reaching schoolyards and greener suburban parks. In the first of these gritty neighborhoods of council flats and drab housing estates east of Newcastle, just a mile or two down the trail from Segundunum, the beginning of the walk, I looked up and saw a gang of youths blocking the trail. My guidebook had warned me that walkers had been hassled along here, and I thought, oh, great. I'm going to get mugged before I even start. I gripped my trekking poles and pressed ahead. Getting closer, I saw that they were 8 to 12 years old. Well, I thought, there's still a lot of them, and I'm wearing a pack. They could easily push me over and I couldn't get up, let alone run. Good afternoon, I said, too loudly, I'm sure. They nodded, stared at me, and then one asked if I'd seen any policemen. Trick question. If I say no, I'm toast. They'll pin me down, take all my cash, and leave me on the ground wriggling like a beetle with my hands and feet in the air. I decided to keep my options open. Yes, about a mile back. A lie, but I thought a prudent lie. The reaction was priceless, especially for anyone who's seen young boys doing something they shouldn't. Really? Where? How far is a mile? They were agitated. Turns out they had a little motorbike they were trying to start, which is against the law on the trail, and my answer had sent them into a tizzy. Now, in the next two passages I'll read, I'll go a lot deeper into the walk. That was just the first day. This is getting close to the end. It sort of resonates with the themes we started talking about and some of the quotes that Suzanne used. I discovered that on a long walk such as this, life becomes simplified, focused, and clear. Everything I had went in my backpack each morning. The only task I had besides walking to the next inn or bed and breakfast was to enjoy the day, the history, the scenery, and the birds. In other words, the goal was to enjoy the moments as the miles ticked by. Yes, I did look at the time and think about how long it was for lunch or arrival at my room for the night, sometimes in a mild panic. But I walked and looked, spied some birds, and I thought. For 9 days, I carried everything I had, and I had to keep going. I suppose that's true in a sense of any travel, but a mile 10 out of 20 for the day, the only way to go was forward. This wasn't a day trip. I didn't have a car. I couldn't turn back to the inn I had checked out of that morning. I had to keep going. As I thought about this during the walk, sort of meta thinking about what was happening, I thought about how we live this way every day. It sounds trite, I'm sure, to say that we have to keep going. And perhaps it is trite. But think about how hard that can be. We have all lived in the past, dwelling on successes or failures or resentments, rather than moving ahead. And we have all known someone who couldn't move forward. We say they are paralyzed by grief, fear, indecision, depression. They can't get on with their lives. They can't move. The metaphor of movement, of progress along our life's journey or pilgrimage, is fundamental to how we think about ourselves and our lives. There are many paths, yes, but only one direction, forward. Maybe it gets harder to move on. I'm not sure we look back more as we grow older, but there is more to look back on. Regrets, resentments, joy, successes. We carry the past with us, just as I carried my pack forward every day. Sometimes that feels very heavy indeed, sometimes lighter, but we carry who we are. The pack gets heavier as we get older, as dreams fade or become realities, as we lose loved ones. This burden, the things he carried, must have been very heavy for my father, and he could not keep going. And now I'm going to read my fourth passage, which is right at the end of the last night before I finished. The last day is a day of pain and blisters and such, which I'm sure Suzanne could resonate with as well. So I finished in London, or end up back in London. But the night before, I sat in that beautiful room on Hillside Farm on Boosted Hill, after Sandra, the B&B owner, had picked me up at the pub, watching the sun set over Scotland. This was my true moment of triumph. My sore feet were resting on the windowsill. I had a glass of wine and a beautiful view over the marshy field to the river and its wide banks. The water still shimmered at first in the glow of the sun, heading back across the Atlantic to my home in Indiana. Purple clouds, flat as anvils and long across the horizon, slowly became darker, etched in blues as the sun finally set. The travails and pains of the next day, yet unknown, were ahead of me. I was happy. I had done it. And then the next day, it was over. For a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I lived in the moment. Reliving the routes and photos and researching in Hadrian and the Wall was my work as I prepared for my lecture. But soon life intervened. Deadlines, meetings, another trip, the daily grind. Experience faded to memory. This is how we remember a death. The loved one is there, in the house, in class, at work, always available on the phone. And then he's not. For a while, for a parent or close friend, he stays alive in your heart, in your experience. You can feel him. But experience soon fades to memory, and memories dim. He's alive in photographs and stories from time to time, but he's gone. A few months after the walk on Hadrian's Wall, as 25 years became 25 years and 3 months, I realized while walking the dog by the creek that I would never have a conversation with my father. That seems obvious, of course, hardly unique to me. Indeed, that acute realization is one of the most painful parts of grief when a loved one dies. But memories fade. 1 year becomes 5, 10, and now 25. Experience fades and becomes memory. Memory becomes narrative. I had started a conversation. I realized with new clarity after that walk in August that the conversation was one way. And that's the last chapter, followed by an epilogue. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. I'm going to start by sharing a short video, 2 minutes with slides and music of the Camino, so that if you haven't been on the Camino, you get a chance to kind of shake yourself there with some images. Bob's got the wall behind him. I've just got a bookshelf. So I'm going to take you through a few slides and songs. But a question I had too is, are there people among us who have walked the Camino? Wave your hand if you've walked the Camino. Anybody here who has walked it? Okay. Well, there are many ways to walk it, as I was saying earlier, and there's the examples of Hadrian's Wall, but there's also many of you have been on walks in your life. You can take a walk around your block. You can take a walk in your very own neighborhood and have these kinds of experiences. I was with Connie just yesterday walking in a park. That could be her Camino, you know? But what I want to do is take you here to see what the Camino looks like in Spain, as you consider what this poetry might have to say about your own Camino. Let me see if I can get this to work. Make sure I have it turned off there, where it comes back at us. And that music is by Oliver Schroer, who is a Canadian violinist who walked the Camino. The beautiful album of Camino music, if you want to check it out. That's his music. The Camino, she said, peering into my eyes as though I could comprehend, will be a condensed experience of your entire life. Pilgrim routine. Like walking with Gandhi on the 24-day Salt March, or Padre Miguel de Escoto on a 14-day Station of the Cross for Peace in Nicaragua, or Cree youth on a 1,600-kilometer trek for Indigenous rights from Wapanagutsi to Ottawa, or like monks in a heritage or nuns in a cloister. Each day greets us with discipline of deepening routine. Rise to the first glint of day, pull on same clothes, gather up belongings, caminar, caminar, caminar. Move at meditation's pace, climb, rest, descend, exert, rest, reflect. Caminar, caminar, caminar. Arrive at the abbey, the convent, an encampment, a benevolent village, to wash, wring, and hang the day's clothes, rest, coddle feet, eat, drink, sleep. Another daybreak, wake. Begin all over again. Caminar, caminar, caminar. Our souls imperceptibly altered. You know, along the Camino, there are many, you pass by many places where you're just totally awestruck by the sacredness of places, whether that's in some old church where there's something, no matter where you are with Christianity, there's something really special happening in there, in the quiet and the candles and the light and then there's the landscape. You're so taken by all this. Here's a short poem about that. Shifting shadows in the olive grove, medieval monastery ruins, still at prayer. And at the same time, you know you're walking through history where there has been terrible things. I mean, you know, from the Inquisition to bringing over the gold and the killing of that's in all these churches, you know, and knowing the indigenous people who were killed to get it. The burning of witches. I mean, the throwing out of the Jews and the Muslims. It goes on in terms of what we've done in the name of Christianity and politics to humanity. And so you walk along thinking about that. But at the same time, I also, before I left, I developed plantar fasciitis. So I had a lot of pain. So it didn't take long before I felt this poem. Roman cobbled roads. Have you been to Europe? Who's been to Europe? You know, in Europe, you see it more in Europe, those cobblestone roads, you know, where there's lots of those. Roman cobbled roads, built by forced labor, stone by stone. Back roads for Franco's troops. No wonder so much pain underfoot. As we said, one of the things Bob was remembering his father. My friend Beth had died 3 years before of cancer, and she actually took me on a whole quest of getting into writing because she always said, you know, you can't always be a social activist your whole life. You've got to sometimes take time to give time to your writing. And she was a painter. She was a Buddhist and a painter of landscape. And I never gave it time. But when she died, I thought, wow, I've only got so much time left. So I was very fortunate in that, because maybe Bob talks, it's interesting that now it's been 10 years. Well, she does feel very distant. But at that point, 3 years, the veil was very thin and I felt her very, very present. I wore a necklace of hers. I was in dialogue with her all the way. And poor Joe, who's there on that dark screen, he didn't have a chance, couldn't hardly get a word in edgewise because I was with my friend and Beth in dialogue all the time. But here is her speaking to me as a painter. Delight. Now that I have left this life, my paintbrush at rest beneath my easel, to help you be awake as you walk the landscape of northern Spain, I bequeath to you my sight. Eyes of a painter trained and inspired so that you too will see shades of color, shifting tones, textures and depth, shadows and shapes. Awake, don't miss it. Newborn radiance rediscovers abandoned crevices, entices the horizon to strum love songs upon the sky, invites the thinnest of stems to be at prayer with the universe. Boundaries dissolve. We are one. Don't worry, my friend, a pen paused in the air if you can't find the words. That palette of infinite use for describing what you see. Simply let the sight seep deep. And from there, trust. A syllable will come sweeping to you like that bird of the wild just flown from the brush. As you walk into these days, behold and hold all that astounds. I bequeath to you my eye. It was Joe who had the realization that when you walk, and maybe this is true with a lot of long hikes, but it's also true with life, that there'd be three things. One, you get up in the morning and you're walking into wonder, that you're out under the stars and you're in the darkness and this awe of dawn as you walk. And then you stop for coffee and a pastry to have your morning breakfast. And then it's delight, as in that past poem. The colors are bright and you feel so alive and like you can go anywhere. But then in the whole, feel like there's peace in the world. Like everything must be right in the world because you feel so right. But then there's what the third part of the day, afternoon, it gets hot, you're tired, you're not sure if you can make it to that day's destination, and it's effort. And this is about the effort. Tears of despair in the night, only halfway to Santiago. Just maybe I can't make it. Feet on the path in the dawn, already halfway there. Just maybe I can. You know, you meet people all along the Camino who all have something to teach you. It's beautiful. It's like Canterbury Tales, you know. And and Bob's book talks about this too. People you meet up with, and we meet up with people all the time, every day. But because we're too busy at the checkout line or too busy, whatever it is we're doing that day, we may not have a moment to think about, well, what's that person have to teach me? And walking the Camino, you're constantly with people who have something to teach you. So one of these women was a young woman who Joe named the Gazelle. He named her that because we would be trudging up the next mountain and she would come whisking right by. And so we called her the Gazelle, this young woman. And we later found out at the end of the Camino, when we met up with her, she arrived at the same time. But that's because we were kind of going like this. And she was doing these big routes, you know. We were doing our 20K a day and she was doing 40K a day, you know. So, but we found out she was had been the coach for the U.S. Olympic volleyball team. So that got things into a little bit more perspective, eh? But this is about her. This is about when we first met the Gazelle and what did she have to teach us? Whoosh! Having reached the summit, strangers gathered for one collective catching of breath. In silent chorus, our eyes amble the cathedral expanse, inhaling nature's blue dome, to only then rest on the stone cross standing human-sized before us. Shuffling our feet, one by one, our poles discreetly lean in to read the centuries-washed inscription, then sway back, mute, stunned by a presence we dare not touch. Each stranger watches the other, speculating whether anyone else feels the same on this perplexing pilgrimage, religious quest in a secular world. Might there be other closet Christians in our midst, or someone who left the church but still is moved by the prophetic message of their roots? Too timid, given the sins of the church, to show devotion before the rest of us? Whoosh! A gazelle leaps up the slope, catching sight of the sacred in her flight. The long-legged youth sprints through the crowd of besieged bystanders, places her hand firmly on the cross, kneels and bows to the divine in all. You know, you stay in dorms, usually. You can stay in pensiones, little hotels along the way, or kind of like bed and breakfast kind of things. But most people stay in dorms, which can be quite, has its own charm. And one of them is this. I don't know why there's so much fuss about snoring in the dorm. When I wake up, everything's perfectly hushed. I'll read that again just for fun. I don't know why there's so much fuss about snoring in the dorm. When I wake up, everything's perfectly hushed. You know what Joe would do? He would be on the top bunk with a towel, and whenever I start to snore, he'd swing it down below to help wake me up. Not to hurt me, but just I'd roll over and stop snoring for the next 20 minutes. The other thing that happens when you live in dorms is that you lose things all the time. But even that has something to teach you. Losing things. The things we lose along the way. The pants fallen into a crack between the bunk and the wall. Essentials tossed in the lost and found. Would that be my scarf she's wearing? Water bottle I forgot at the top of the hill. Hat left on the table in the cafe bar. Flashlight dropped when I bent to tie my shoes in the glare of the plaza, unmissed until the dark edge of town. No going back. Reminders of the things I didn't know I could do without. Clothes in my closet I never wear. Resentments that no longer matter. Failures that were only glinches. Sorrows that stir into sweetness. Longings that discover presence. All stones to be left at the crustillero. The finding of ourselves in the losing, our packs all the lighter. And then you end up going, a lot of time you're walking through countryside and from village to village. Of course, the villages are so close here in Canada, we'd be walking forever to the next village. But because it's basically the distance we walked is from Toronto to Ottawa to Toronto. But it would be very different in Europe where all the villages are very close together. But you also, in that walk, come to about 3 big city, urban areas, which is a whole other experience. 2 short poems about that. Day off in Leon, lost in the crowds. We nearly lose sight of why we are here. Everything we forgot to bring, we're learning to do without, can be purchased for a price. You know, you come into these villages and you're in a hurry because you one of the problems with the Camino right now is there's so many people are walking and you're not sure at your day's end if there's going to be a place for you or if you're going to have to sleep, walk on to the next village. So you always kind of live with this pressure that you got to get going. But it also is kind of a metaphor for our own lives because our own lives are always the next thing, the next thing, the next thing I'm going to do, rather than really being present in the moment. And of course, in the Camino, you're trying to get to Santiago, but you're also really trying to be fully present in this experience. And this is kind of about that. And the title is in Spanish, Algo más, señora, which means anything else, ma'am? Anything else I can do for you today, ma'am? Anything else? Algo más, señora? If you ran a village restaurant in a house built 400 years ago with stone-framed windows welcoming in the sun, under a low ceiling of hand-hewn chestnut beams, clutching a vine that took 16 years to grow across them, all to the sound of bells ringing from an 800-year-old belfry next to a Roman bridge, that has offered passage for nearly 2,000 years. You would never be in a hurry to make my sandwich. To the resonance of violins, he solemnly slices the cheese and ham, devoutly cleans the blade. Hungry peregrinos bow their heads in the doorway, approach the counter from either side of me. He anoints with oil the oven-warm bread and graces with lettuce, pickles, and tomatoes. I glance over my shoulder to make sure the newly arrived know this is my sandwich. He christened with spices, planted, nurtured, and harvested from his second fields. On this race to the sacred, peregrinos mumble, "Gotta get going, get a bunk for the night." He glides his hand across the counter to select the perfect knife. Peregrinos shuffle their feet, look at their watches, consider their options. He pauses the blade at the preordained angle and places the sacrament on a plate just as the concerto reaches its diminuendo. Having finally forgotten why I would be in a rush, he looked up to rest his eyes in mine. "Algo más, señora?" Because I had plantar fasciitis, Joe we'd often walk maybe 10 kilometers, and then I'd say, "Joe, you go ahead," because I was hurting, and truth is, I wanted to sit and write poetry. So he would go on, and we would each have our time alone, which was also really nice. It's great to walk alone, and also great to walk with someone dear to you, but also to have the time alone. And so we'd be at our own pace. And a couple of times, because I was in a lot of pain, I actually would stay behind a day or two and take a taxi or a bus to catch up. Joe walked the full 700K. I don't know, maybe I walked 500 of them, but I struggled to walk that much because I was in a lot of pain. And so this is one time when we met up. And one of the things to say too is that on the Camino, you wear two sets of clothes. One is in your pack, the other's on you. So after you finish your walk at the end of the day, the first thing you do is take a shower, put on your clean clothes that you'll sleep in that night, and you take your dirty clothes and you wash them to hang them up to dry. So often, this thing of being at the laundry sink is a ritual of, and so this is one occasion where Joe was walking the Meseta, which is the really, really hot, dry plains, and us meeting up at the laundry sink. At the laundry sink, my love and I meet up at the outdoor laundry sink, too exhausted to speak. He, after a 22-kilometer walk in the relentless heat of the merciless Meseta. I, after a morning of meditation in the cool still of a Templar chapel. Side by side, I lift a wash basin onto the shelf, and he lifts one too. Without a word, we each draw water to soak our clothes, as women around the world do, in refugee camps and creek beds, in dirt patios and basements, alongside rivers and at the mouth of wells. In unison, we immerse our day's dust into the water to wash clean our separate revelations. After rinsing and wringing, we hang them in the sun. Two final poems just to leave you with. Actually, three. When you're at the dorm, everybody, you stay in the dorm, but your shoes aren't allowed in the dorm because they stink, because people have been wearing them. So they really stink. So there's a shelf outside. You get there, you leave your shoes. So you got to wonder about the shoes, the Camino from the perspective of the shoes, because the shoes are really key on the Camino. If you don't have the right shoes, you really hurt. You want to get rid of them. And often people do. You get to where you can't stand it anymore, and you leave them all kinds of places and just go with one pair or find a new pair or trade a pair or anything to try to stop hurting. Soul to soul. Hiking shoes, drenched in pungent aromas, snuggle up to one another. Banned from the dorm as rumors of their stench migrated here long before. Bought for comfort, soaked in sweat, dumped in dung, forced to conform to the unique stride of the caminante who wears them. Haggard hiking shoes, unable to keep pace, forsaken along the way, flung in ditches and creeks, dangling from trees and telephone wires, or worse, plunked on a rock pile, Calvary of someone's pain. But then there are the distinguished ones, proudly placed on display, adorning the portals of fine dining cafes. All of them unattached, out all night. Imagine how they fool around when no one is looking. As for the boots and shoes who made it to this albergue shelf, each one heaves a sigh of relief, because long-standing pairs celebrate as they know what it takes to stay together this long. Step free from the feet that dictate their every move, compliant shoes loosen up, let their tongues flap, get in touch with each other's souls. No matter the country they're from or how exploited the labor behind the label, while peregrinos sleep, jubilant shoes open wide their eyelets, let down their laces, tap their heels, and tiptoe revolt, delighted to have another night off. Fun, eh? The Camino from the perspective of the shoes. So two short ones to leave you with. One is to say that that the goal is to get to Santiago, you know, but there's also other goals too, and there was one day in particular when Joe was waiting for me to show up, and because you got to get there and you got to check into the albergue or to the hostel. Man, he got to this one particular one. They said you can't check in unless your traveling partner's with you. And so he goes to the plaza, gets himself a beer, you know, and he waits and he waits and he waits, and then he has another beer. And then he sees a few people come by that he knows, and they said, "Oh yeah, she's sitting on a wall. She's reading poetry." But what Joe did not know, and we finally got a place, just like the last place I think in the albergue. But what Joe didn't know until this book was launched, that this poem I wrote on that day when he was waiting and waiting and waiting. But I think it's an important poem because it is really about what it means to go to Santiago. If you're thinking, I'll never get to Spain, I can't walk that far, oh, la, 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 la. Well, I want to tell you too that this is also what it is to go to Santiago. Hillside meadow, late summer calls. Stop, lie down and sleep. You have nowhere to go. Just being there in the moment. One more time. It's a beautiful summer. You can go do this. Hillside, meadow, late summer call. Stop, lie down and sleep. You have nowhere to go. And just one other, which is a blessing on the day of going into Santiago, when you're walking in with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, because all the caminos, all the paths converge as you're going into Santiago. This is what I experienced. And so I give this blessing to you, a blessing for you on your Camino. Sunrise through praying eucalyptus. You are forgiven. A sparrow sings sweet, high in the tree. Walk in peace. Mist whispers in the field. Walk softly on the earth. Bubbles tumble into laughing streams. Love all walkers as yourself. Emerald green reveals itself on the other side of the shadowed tunnel. Walk toward the improbable and make it possible. Thank you.
It was just wonderful to hear it again. You know, we did this about a month ago, and we had such a response that we decided to do it again. And it's wonderful to sit here and listen to it all over. I picked up lots of new things this time. So really wonderful. So any questions, thoughts, reactions? We still have a good little crowd here. Anybody want to add something? Be sure to unmute yourself before you start talking.
While you're waiting, I just want to welcome Jimena, who I see has just joined here from Peru. Welcome, Jimena. Bienvenido. Bienvenida. And Noor as well. Noor, so happy you're here today.
And
Thank
actually,
you.
I do have something to add too that Suzanne pointed out that I forgot to say. I think I said last time that my walk was 9 days. And as you pointed out, 6 days were by myself and 3 days were with my wife and daughter. So that notion of walking by yourself and walking with somebody, I resonated with that as well. Originally, I wanted to do it by myself, but it was good. It was a very, fun intermediate, the middle part, which is the prettiest and most famous part, and also the steepest. And I had, my book said that it wasn't a strenuous trail. And so I told my wife, oh, it's flat. And she got there and was like, this is not flat. And so it was a little tricky because some of the hills, they're short, but they're very, very steep. And they're almost ladder-like paths. So that was a slow few days, but it was fun.
Did you have stinky boots as well?
This is going to sound ridiculous, but my feet don't stink. My daughter and my wife's do. But I did have blisters even after 9 days. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, those pictures in that slideshow, I was almost teary because I had walked only 4 days on the Camino del Norte, starting in France, well, at the border, which goes along the coast and the Basque region where I was. And that picture of that church, the town, the small church where everything is paved over, there's no green in that one picture. I saw that. And the wonderful picture that you took of the trail disappearing and then reappearing on the next hill. And that's very much part of Spain. You have a views in Spain that you just don't really get. Well, it depends on parts of Hadrian's Wall. As you leave Northumbria, you do have that vista of the trail behind you. But it's a bigger sky in Spain than in England in some ways. But both beautiful.
One of the things that I was thinking about this time as I was listening is the various things and the symbolism of them, the symbolism of the pack, the symbolism of the boots, the symbolism of the path. I don't know if either of you want to say anything about that.
Well, of course, I was thinking when Suzanne was reading about the boots, or talking about it, of the book Wild, Cheryl Street, starting off with the boots, right? Throwing the boot off the mountain, which is a dramatic scene in the movie, which her book wasn't a model or inspiration for me, but that notion of the boot or the pack is very much part of the journey. I made sure to carry my pack, everything, not camping, no camping for me. And I had reservations, Suzanne. I didn't have to worry except for one night when I knew the kitchen would close before I got there. But my wife and daughter used a service where you can take a suitcase from hotel to hotel. So it was important to me to actually carry it. Yeah. And I know, Suzanne, you had the service, right?
Yeah, I started out carrying it, but then Joe carried his the whole way. Joe walked the whole way, but I reached a point where I couldn't. I was just in too much pain, my plantar fasciitis. So
well, and
I had somebody. About 6 days into it, I realized, oh my gosh, why are all these people leaving their packs at the doorway in the morning? And then I realized these little angels come along and will carry them. So that got me through.
Yeah, the service was very helpful. Last time when I did walk last year in Spain, by the fourth day, I was thinking maybe I'm through with this carrying the pack thing. It gets, the older you get, the harder it gets. And a friend was like, "Do you really have to carry your pack?" No, you don't. And the other thing you mentioned that's really nice and about Spain and Europe and England very much so is that you don't have to camp. You can walk from town to town or village to village very easily and find pubs for lunch, of course, or restaurants for dinner and a nice bed usually, without any difficulty along these trails.
And just to pick up on the theme you're saying, Christina, yeah, of course, the theme of path, right? I mean, Camino means way, or there's that famous expression, we make the way by walking, which is from the Spanish poet. Hacer el camino al andar. And I see how that Nada's just joined from El Salvador.
Yep. Yep.
And Adrian had to leave, but she mentioned walking during lockdown was a liberating experience. And I think I was in Maine for somewhat odd reasons. We were on another sabbatical and had to rent our house, and we came home and we didn't have a place to live. And friends let us stay there, but we were able to, they closed the cliff walk in New York Harbor, but I made a new friend who had a house on the cliff walk so I could walk on a closed path, which was very liberating, I think. So yeah, but it is the other phrase that I think I mentioned last time was solvitur ambulando. It is solved by walking, which is sort of the phrase that people use for labyrinths. And Suzanne mentioned earlier that you can do a pilgrimage anywhere. It doesn't have to be a long walk, but I know people who walk labyrinths all the time, and that's a pilgrimage, an interior pilgrimage, right? And just a small circle, and it's not a real labyrinth. You're not getting lost. You can see where you're going, but it's a meditative journey.
I think too, this thing of letting things go in terms of symbols, right? Talking about the stone and you know, how there are things in our lives we don't let go. And so often what pilgrims do is you start out with a stone that you take from your home and you carry it to reflect on this as you walk until you get to this very high point that's called the crustallero, where you leave it in this huge pile of stones of people who have left other things behind. Or if you don't take that path, people will leave it somewhere along the way. So the stone to be a real symbol, and of course that's something we can do everywhere. Where's a stone we pick up and carry it and meditate on that stone about what is it I'm going to let go in my life that no longer serves me. What am I? How and giving it a good toss. I've been facilitating some poetry readings and guided reflections with different groups, and everybody takes a stone and gets to go away and toss it.
You read a lot of my favorites, and unfortunately I'm in North Carolina. I didn't bring the book because I didn't know we were going to do this again. But the one that I'll have to share with my family is the snoring one. Apparently they tell me I snore, and that poem really cracks me up. I don't believe them, but there's a lot of noise canceling earphones in our household that apparently I've been told people need to use, but doesn't bother me at all. Like you said, I wake up just fine. But that's a great poem. Funny.
Any thoughts or comments or questions?
Appreciated these comments, Kimberly and Rosalie and Adrian as well. Yeah, very nice.
Christine, I'd appreciate, I have not met Bob, but Suzanne is a friend of mine. And the putting together of the stories and the poetic remembrances was just heart inspiring. I was going to say heart wrenching. No, it's not that. But there was delight and humor and serious reflection in you know, it's like little currents running through all this. And I happen to be looking out at a lake that's has gentle waves on it in the setting sun. And I'm thinking, yes, you know, like I can let go of whether I'm here at the lake or I'm just going about my business. The sense of being more reflective, of not being so driven or striven by, what I have to do. Kind of tossing the stone of to do, and being a bit more meditative. And you were in humor and seriousness, all that. There was a delight. Well, thank you both.
You.
Anyone else?
One question. First of all, a comment. I thought it was another similarity between both speakers. Bob's feet don't smell and Suzanne doesn't snore. So there's some self-awareness that sometimes it's good to hide behind. But question to Bob. Suzanne talked about the number of people on the Camino. I didn't get a sense from you in terms of how many people are walking alongside you. I imagine it changes depending upon where you are on the walk, but a sense of how busy the trail was along Hadrian's Wall.
Yeah. Not busy at all until you get to the center part. The famous part in the middle where there's actually what they call the most beautiful parking lot in the world, where the buses can go and people do day hikes near Housesteads. So in the middle, you get a lot of action. The beginning, I don't think I saw anybody until I got to my first night walking through Newcastle. And in the end in Cumbria, I saw people coming the other way. I'm a relatively slow walker, so people passed us, but we saw lots of people coming the other way. But in the middle, when the weather was interesting too, there'd be these sort of spontaneous groups of people stopping who were going the opposite direction. I walked it east to west, which is the way the Romans built it, and some people walk it the other way. And so we just sort of gathered in a field and talked and chatted, and then you keep going because you're going two different directions. Unlike the Camino, where you're all going to Santiago, right? People have preferences on direction. Towards the end, if you read the book, I ran into two Dutch guys that irritated me greatly, because they led me on a wrong turn or two, and they kept passing me. So anyway, but I don't think mine was as social. I mean, my middle part with my family was different, and I was probably spent more time talking to people over dinner, servers and folks at the bar or whatever, where I was eating. I was sitting at the bar rather than by myself.
So is it fair to say then that your experience was kind of moving along a trail through a place, seeing people in different places as you're walking along, whereas the Camino sounds a bit more like a community moving together, that shared experience of the Camino. You don't necessarily have that on Hadrian's Walk, where you're kind of experiencing things as you walk past them.
I think that's fair. And I've talked to several people who have done the Camino Francis that Suzanne and Doerge did, right?
Mhm.
The main one, and including people I met in Spain last summer on the Camino del Norte, and in the Basque region. I mean, as Suzanne said, it's 1,200 years old, and the Norte path, del Norte, was during the Moorish occupation, when they sort of walked around the Moorish lands along the coast. But as far as I could tell, in the Basque region, they still weren't comfortable with pilgrims there, and locals seemed kind of, why are you walking this trail? Well, we've been doing it for 1,200 years. And the people I talked to who had walked other Caminos had the same experience. It's a very, very desolate, relatively lonely path compared to the stories I've heard from the Camino Francis. From people I know who were very good friends with folks that they walked with still. But there's a wildness to the Del Norte that I'll probably go back and finish it one day. I just didn't have time last summer.
Any other thoughts?
Thank you for the questions. Good question.
Christine, I wonder, just from something you said, just made me think of one short poem. I wonder if I might read that as a way of beginning to wrap
Oh,
up.
I do
this
have to say
episode.
quickly, Suzanne, because you talked about the gazelle. We were in Norway a few years ago on a walk up a glacier, and it was short, but the hardest trail. It wasn't even a trail. They called it a trail. It wasn't a trail. But this group of Norwegians passed us, and it's like they don't touch the ground. They just sort of floated by like, like elves or something, and we're just in the path and something like that. So I resonated with that too.
All right, Suzanne, you're going to bring us to a close here.
Yes, just to maybe I was just thinking from what he was just saying, just to kind of honor the people who live in these places. And we are the pilgrims going through it, but there are many people who for generations who have lived on this. And just as you were describing that more isolated part of the path, I thought it's not only the people that you encounter, but it's the people who actually live there. So maybe just to offer this always. In the early days of fall, she hooks a bucket over her arm, just like her mother before her, steps onto the patio and into the shade of a fertile tree. She glimpses up into the branches, sun splashing her seasoned cheeks to grasp the ripest pears. She will place them on a wooden table by the path to Santiago with a sign that reads gratis o donativo. One could say it's a religious act, this Galician custom of welcoming pilgrims, one that has always been. At summer's end, her beloved tends the border of the field just as his father before him. He chops the lower sprouted branches from the trees his great-grandfather planted to shade the pilgrim path. He is older now, arthritis in his hips, but the tree continues to sprout, so he goes out. Axe in his hand to tend them as best he can. So absorbed in his task, he fails to notice that he prunes to the tune of pilgrims passing, as they always will.
Very good ending. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming. And as I said earlier, this has been recorded. So if you want to tell people about it, it will be on our website. Probably not tomorrow, but certainly by Monday. And I'll be sending a note around about that. So thank you all again for attending. Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. And Christine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Love to El Salvador, night in El Salvador, Camino in Peru. Everyone.
Have a good evening.
Good night.
Good night. Good
Thank
night.
you. Bye-bye.
Unbelievable.